Let's start with a little bit of etymology of the word Genesis. Genesis. So in Latin, Genesis, but it has a root that is Greek and it means to be born. So the origin of Genesis is origin. So of a man, of the universe, of languages, of law. Our work of art is conceived, is also called a Genesis, for example, the Genesis of Divine Comedy. The creation of the world, as it is narrated in the first book of the Bible, is also called Genesis. We have Genesis, and then we have another important concept, identity. And identity, etymologically, comes from the Latin that means the same. So the same is something related to each other without identifying a major change. In narrative identity, is the form that the human being can access through the narrative function, as Paul Ricoeur defines it, and which in this case is important not to fall into the semantic ambiguity that waits on the notion of identity. In this, according to Ricoeur, two distinct meanings overlap, which in Latin are expressed by idem and ipse. The first meaning, identical, points to what is extremely similar, analogous. The second, ipse, same, equality, implies almost a form of immutability over time, the opposite of being different. The second meaning, according to the author, does not imply fixation, but the possibility of change and permanence, compatible with identity, in the sense of what he calls ipseity, so uh, the state of being ipse. When it comes to the identity of a group in a narrative and not a character, or rather when the characters and themes constitute the history of a group, community, nation, identity, the discourse is also applicable. The meaning is that of ipse, of which existing permanently can be changeable, being in this capacity that lies the survival of the group. The question, in fact, that characterizes this type of narrative is the movement of the characters, of the events, of the plot, of the spaces, of the times, of convergence towards an idea of unity, of union, of uniformity, even though these may pass through the finding of an inevitable variety, or even in the feeling of loss of an unfulfilled and therefore erased memory. They are like spaces that include systems of representations that members of society and ethnic groups have of their own existence, not only because of the connection with the geographical space, but also with the past itself and with the spiritual dimension. Let's say that this type of narrative has a center that is linked to the question of the heart of what we are. We may not have an exact perception of what it is, and we are searching in a search for the universe of words, which is in the end a journey through the real, a real which, in the case of identity, has three times: past, present, and future. So the narrative proceeds in the sense of reaching the point that has the tension by several lines that go towards the center, that converge. So from an horizontal line, space, place of rest, life and death. From a vertical line, time, spirit, sensations, and diagonal lines, the place of different possibilities and views according to different points of view, builds a surface. Vasily Kandinsky considers that this is the image of the star shape, of straight lines organized around a common nucleus, and that becomes more dense and as it is developed and constitutes the birth of this new form, the birth of this surface. The narrative dimension of identity is an interpretative scheme that has as its object the stories themselves. the narratives of others, popular or of the dominant culture, the reflection of the intellectuals and the works of the artists. It does not exist out of nowhere, but it is rather rooted in the production and thinking of the community itself, while contributing in turn to create something in which the community sees itself. It should also be borne in mind that if literature is a mirror of the nation, it is also one of the elements that transform a people into a nation. There is therefore a convergence of memories, feelings, common myths uh, that are dynamic, changeable, and but that bring men together in an identification, a national identification, a group identification. The text can act as a trigger through attention, effective memories, associations, recognition factors, emotions, conscious or unconscious, that activate the will to analyze, to think about our identity. It is not always a painless process. Sometimes we find what we wouldn't like to find. So they do not always mitigate identity or leave us pacified with it. But these texts, these narrative, um, these narratives of the identity keep us alert, and that is so important, especially when we have identities that put together different cultural groups and different cultural um, identities or ethnicities, and together they make a new story, the story of, uh, of the nation, a multicultural nation, for example.